Dimensional Trader in Marvel Chapter 41. This job is right up my alley. In May, after spending over a month in the detention center, Lyndon Schneider walked out through the steel gates, carrying his luggage. As soon as he stepped outside, he spotted Dix across the street, leaning against a car and smoking. "Welcome back, Doc." Dix extinguished his cigarette, casually flicking it aside, and strode over to greet him. "Hey, Dix. How dare you show up here so openly? Aren't you still wanted?" Lyndon Schneider asked, visibly surprised. He clearly remembered that night over a month ago when he saw their other accomplice, Goss, being taken into custody along with the broker, Corby. He also knew Corby had sold everyone out. Dix should be on the wanted list, yet here he was, standing boldly outside the detention center. "Ha ha ha, wanted. That's old news. My warrant was rescinded over 2 weeks ago," Dix said proudly, taking Schneider's suitcase. "What happened?" Schneider asked, thoroughly confused. "It's pretty simple. Corby retracted his confession, and Goss took the blame for everything. So, I was off the hook," Dix explained with a tinge of sadness. Although he was free, the thought of his good friend Goss serving extra years in prison weighed on him. Was it Mr. Khan? Schneider immediately made the connection. The only person with enough influence to orchestrate such an outcome had to be Josh Khan, the man who had convinced him to turn himself in. In truth, Schneider knew his early release and comfortable treatment in the detention center were all thanks to Josh's intervention. Initially, he assumed Josh was helping because of his connection to Schneider's late father. But now, seeing Dix also receiving such care, Schneider realized there must be another reason behind Josh's generosity. "Of course. Who else but Mr. Khan? He even asked me to pick you up today. Come on, hop in, I'll take you to see your new home." Dix clapped Schneider on the shoulder and led him to the car. "New home? What new home?" Schneider asked, puzzled. "A cozy apartment, obviously. Unless you'd rather sleep on the streets." Dix joked. "This is also arranged by Mr. Khan, isn't it? And I take it you're working for him now?" Schneider asked. "Absolutely. Bosses as generous as Mr. Khan are hard to come by. Look at this car. A Chrysler. Nice, isn't it? A gift from him." Dix proudly patted the steering wheel. "It's a fine car," Schneider acknowledged, running his hand over the leather seats. "Don't worry, you'll get one too." Dix laughed heartily. Dix drove swiftly, and in about half an hour, they arrived at an apartment building in the Upper North neighborhood. The building wasn't far from Josh's old place, but the apartment was much more spacious, a comfortable 800 square foot space, which was more than enough for a single man like Schneider. "Here are the keys. Take some time to settle in. Later, I'll come back and take you out for a surprise to celebrate your release. Ever heard of Night Rosé? The girls there are fiery hot," Dix said with a wink. "Dix, all of this was arranged by Mr. Khan, wasn't it?" "I think I should thank him in person," Schneider said. He felt uneasy accepting so much without giving anything in return. "Relax, buddy. Just enjoy yourself today. You'll meet Mr. Khan tomorrow," Dix reassured him. Despite Dix's words, Schneider couldn't fully shake his unease. However, as Dix had promised, the girls at Night Rose were so intoxicatingly charming that Schneider quickly forgot all his worries. By the time he woke up, it was nearly noon the next day. Later that afternoon, Dix took Schneider to meet Josh at a small but clean restaurant. Oddly, although it was lunchtime, the restaurant was empty except for Josh and a single waitress. "That's Anna, Lewis's wife. After Lewis passed away, it's just her and their son. I used my share of the money to buy this restaurant for her to run so they'd have some stability," Dix explained, noticing Schneider's curiosity. "As for today, the restaurant is closed temporarily because Mr. Khan is here." Schneider nodded in understanding. He also suspected that Dix's care for Anna and her son went beyond mere kindness, but that wasn't his business. "Mr. Schneider, you're looking well. I heard from Dix. 4 ladies last night. Truly impressive," Josh teased with a smile as Schneider entered. Schneider's felt embarrassed at the remark. Though he was older and somewhat reserved, his Bavarian roots didn't prevent him from enjoying life's pleasures. After being cooped up for so long, he had let loose last night, indulging himself to the fullest. "Mr. Khan, you jest. I must thank you for your hospitality. I owe you so much, and I don't know how to repay you." If there's anything you need me to do, please just let me know, Schneider said respectfully. If he had initially seen Josh as a young man deserving respect because of his father, he now regarded him as a truly capable and influential figure. Excellent. It seems you understand why I've done all this. In that case, I'll get straight to the point. The work I have for you isn't difficult. I have a lot of sensitive goods that need to be sold and some materials I need to procure. But given the current situation in the US, I need someone sharp to handle these matters for me, Josh explained bluntly. Schneider instantly understood. Sensitive goods. Procurement. In other words, smuggling. And, as luck would have it, this was a line of work he was very familiar with. Ah, this job, I'm a pro at it, he said confidently. Chapter 42. Tobacco. These are the first batch of goods you'll be handling. In a warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago's industrial district, Josh gestured toward the room full of wooden crates and addressed Lyndon Schneider and Dix. He pointed at one of the crates beside him. Dix, open it. Dix stepped forward and opened the crate as instructed. Seeing its contents, Dix's eyes lit up, and Lyndon Schneider's widened in astonishment. Tobacco of such high quality. Lyndon exclaimed. Are all the crates in this warehouse tobacco? That's right. All of it is raw, processed tobacco. Your job is to figure out how to sell it. Whether you sell it as loose tobacco or make it into cigarettes, I don't care. Once sold, you each get 10% of the profits, and another 10% will go to the other associates. The rest comes to me. Alternatively, instead of cash, you can give me other goods I need, such as firearms, steel, cloth, grain, and so on. If you find better trade deals, let me know in advance. What do you think? Any questions? Josh asked, looking at Lyndon. In later generations, when people discuss the most profitable illegal industries, their first thoughts usually jump to gambling, drugs, or arms trafficking. Especially drugs, which often boast hundreds of times the profit margin. However, many people don't realize that in America, drugs have never been the most lucrative illegal industry. By the 21st century, while drugs like cocaine and heroin could generate over $100 billion in annual sales in the US, their net profit margins weren't actually that high, less than 20%. The reasons included high processing costs, market dispersion, and high transportation risks. It only seemed extraordinarily profitable because of multiple layers of distribution inflating its apparent value. In fact, when compared to industries like health supplements, e.g., sugar water sold as bird's nest, costing $3 to produce and sold for 30, drugs weren't as profitable. As for arms trafficking, the real money lies in legitimate arms deals conducted by major corporations. Even the so-called Lord of War, at his peak only made a few $billion annually from illegal transactions. So, what's the most profitable illegal industry in America? Between 1919 and the 1950s, it was alcohol, thanks to prohibition. After the 1950s, it became cigarettes, contraband tobacco. Legal tobacco is already a highly profitable industry, and illegal contraband cigarettes are even more so. Take New York in 2021 as an example. Because of the nation's highest cigarette taxes, a pack of legal cigarettes retailed for an average of $13, with a wholesale price of $12.50, leaving a profit margin of only 50 cents. Contraband cigarettes, however, had a cost price of under $1 per pack for smugglers. Including transportation costs, it wouldn't exceed $3. They could sell to local distributors at $5 to $6, yielding a profit margin of over 200%. Downstream distributors could sell contraband cigarettes at $12, still undercutting legal market prices, and earn $5 to $6 per pack, a profit margin exceeding 100%. In other regions, where cigarettes aren't as expensive, the average retail price still exceeds $7 per pack. This enormous profit margin has led to contraband, illicit cigarettes occupying over 60% of the US market. The risks also differ dramatically between drugs and tobacco. Selling drugs, even in small quantities, risks severe criminal charges and often results in the loss of citizenship rights. Penalties were even harsher in earlier decades. Selling contraband cigarettes, by contrast, unless caught by the IRS with irrefutable evidence, offenders usually face a fine at most. The disparity in risk is worlds apart. As a result, starting in the 1950s, organized crime groups like the Mafia, known for their structured operations and efficient logistics, shifted their focus toward tobacco sales. Let the Mexicans and Colombians handle the drugs. Tobacco is where the real money is. Once I read a fact that by the 1990s, 90% of the contraband cigarettes in the US were made in China. The only challenge with contraband tobacco lies upstream. It requires skilled management. This was why Josh placed so much trust in Lyndon Schneider. Known as a criminal expert, Schneider wasn't just highly intelligent and experienced in smuggling. He was also a legitimate doctor, holding a PhD from the University of Munich in national economics. How someone with that background ended up resorting to theft is anyone's guess. Then again, given Germany's post-World War I economic collapse, perhaps it wasn't too surprising. How much tobacco is here? Schneider asked, his expression solemn as he surveyed the warehouse filled with crates. 40 tons. Josh replied with a grin. 40 tons. Schneider gasped, his hand trembling. In this era, cigarette prices were influenced by currency purchasing power. A carton of cigarettes cost around $10. While this might not seem high, when adjusted for purchasing power relative to gold, it was actually more expensive than in later generations. By 2021, the dollar had devalued nearly 40-fold. 40 tons of tobacco, if used responsibly, could yield around 40 million cigarettes, 1 million packs, or 100,000 cartons, valued at $2 million. However, contraband sellers weren't concerned with quality. By loosening the rolls or mixing in dry grass, production could double to 80 million cigarettes. Even after accounting for downstream sales margins, they could clear $2 million in profit. If their cut was 20%, that meant $400,000, a far better return than stealing gemstones, where a $1 million haul might net 30%. Not to mention, selling tobacco carried significantly lower risks. Of course we can do it. Schneider exclaimed, his eyes gleaming. Contraband tobacco wasn't just lucrative and low risk. It could also be bartered for resources that money couldn't buy, especially in chaotic regions like Europe. If this tobacco were shipped to Europe, Schneider could trade it for a fortune in gold. However, Mr. Karn, selling such a large quantity will require startup funds, additional weapons, and manpower, Schneider added after calming himself. Manpower and weapons have already been prepared by Dix, and here's $50,000 as startup capital. Also, I'd like to introduce someone. Lieutenant Dietrich, step forward, Josh said, clapping his hands. From the shadows, a man in plain clothes emerged. It was none other than Police Captain Dietrich, who had appeared several times before. Mr. Kahn, long time no see, Mr. Schneider. Dietrich greeted Josh respectfully before turning to Schneider with a faintly arrogant demeanor. Captain Dietrich. Schneider greeted him with a peculiar expression, immediately grasping why Josh had introduced the captain. The profits from tobacco were the carrot, and Dietrich's presence was the stick. Having someone like Dietrich on their side would undoubtedly simplify tobacco sales. By the way, Schneider, your early release wouldn't have been possible without the captain's help. He and his colleagues will also take a cut of the profits. You'll need to work closely together, Josh said with a smile. We're all smart people here. You understand what this business represents. This is just the first shipment. Do well, and everyone will prosper. But if anyone gets other ideas, I suggest they think twice about the consequences. The group hastily nodded in agreement. Good. I'll leave the rest to you. I have other matters to attend to, Josh said before leaving the warehouse. As for whether Schneider would betray him and keep the tobacco, Josh wasn't worried. He had 2 layers of safeguards. First, Dix's men were Kentucky cowboys, all with families. Even Dix himself had ties to Lewis's widow. Schneider wouldn't succeed without their cooperation. Second, there was Dietrich, a genuine dirty cop whose weaknesses Josh had thoroughly exploited. With a family to support and a lucrative stake in the tobacco trade, Dietrich had every reason to remain loyal. The odds of betrayal were slim, especially since Josh controlled the supply chain. And where was that supply chain? Westeros. Yes, beyond legitimate trade ventures, Josh had discovered another goldmine in tobacco during his dealings with Daenerys. In Westeros, tobacco wasn't smoked but chewed, much like betel nut. Due to its medicinal properties and addictive nature, it was highly popular among the nobility. This had led to extensive cultivation, especially in Daenerys's slave-free regions, where labor costs were negligible. For Daenerys, however, tobacco was a useless commodity in her quest for conquest. She was happy to sell it to Josh at rock-bottom prices, giving him another delightful surprise. Chapter 43. Howard. Captain America. Time flies, and before anyone realized, summer had arrived, bringing with it the sweltering heat of Chicago. Early in the morning, Josh, dressed in a polo shirt, sat leisurely in the yard, sipping coffee. Of course, it wasn't just coffee he indulged in. He wasn't some city dweller from Shanghai, dependent on coffee to survive. Occasionally, he would have some black tea too. As for green tea, it wasn't that he didn't want to drink it. The issue was that, much like in Britain, black tea dominated the market in the US. Outside of Chinatown, finding green tea was nearly impossible. But with the raging Pacific War, Asian goods were hardly making it across the ocean. Even in Chinatown, green tea was scarce, and whatever was available was mostly low-quality tea dust. The situation might be slightly better on the West Coast in Los Angeles, but in a Midwest city like Chicago. Sigh. So, for the time being, Josh had resigned himself to drinking coffee and black tea. Honestly, he could count himself lucky. Thanks to his wealth and influence, he could afford such luxuries. For an ordinary person, even coffee and black tea were hard to come by, both were rationed items. Coffee was limited to 1 pound every 5 weeks per person, and black tea to 20 grams per week. What kind of rationing is that? Feeding a cat? Well, he only had to endure this for 2 more years. He was young and could wait it out. Darling, I've got some bad news. It seems you've caught the attention of the USO, said Margaret, wearing a sheer white dress as she sat down beside Josh with an invitation in hand. 3 months. They're here to sell bonds again. Josh groaned at the mention of the USO. It was early July. Back in late March, he had purchased $3 million worth of bonds, which had indeed brought him considerable fame and benefits. For example, the establishment of 3 factories had gone almost without a hitch, with raw material supplies guaranteed. The syrup factory, in particular, had hired researchers from the University of Chicago, leading to the successful mass production of glucose isomerase just a month ago. The first batch of corn syrup had passed military testing a week ago. After evaluation by military representatives, the entire batch, along with future production, was contracted by the military. Josh had thus secured a partnership with the world's most powerful military at the time. Not necessarily for the quality, but because, in terms of scale and equipment, the U.S. Army was undoubtedly number one. However, there was a price to pay. Since then, he had been targeted by numerous anti-fascist organizations of that era, constantly seeking donations. Aren't you a pioneer against fascism? You can afford $3 million in bonds. Surely, a few thousand or tens of thousands for our cause isn't too much to ask. Thankfully, most of these small organizations were easy to handle. He would often excuse himself by saying, "All my money went into bonds. How about I donate some bonds instead?" At that point, they usually backed off. These organizations needed cash and supplies. Bonds, while valuable, couldn't be liquidated in the short term, but leave the bonds untouched. Then the question arose, were these groups really fighting fascism or just lining their pockets? However, if they tried cashing the bonds at a bank, impossible. The military sold bonds to raise funds for the war effort. Cashing them in early, that was out of the question. A regular citizen lacking money might be excused, but an anti-fascist organization doing so, it would look like they were undermining the U.S. military. The ones tied to the military, however, weren't so easy to dismiss. Josh's syrup factory had just secured a massive military contract. Claiming poverty wouldn't work. The U.S. military was a model client in this regard. Most contracts were prepaid or paid upon delivery. No delays or IOUs. Unlike the British neighbors, who were notorious for handing out IOUs. But Josh had barely received the money when the USO came knocking. The invitation they sent him was clear. You've made quite the profit from your orders. Isn't it time to support us? Maybe buy some more bonds. The interest is decent, and you wouldn't lose out, would you? Could Josh refuse? If he didn't buy, he could kiss future military contracts goodbye. Of course, Josh wasn't particularly attached to the military orders. With his trading system, selling the same syrup to Daenerys would yield profits far greater than selling to the military. But the title of military supplier mattered to him. This title was his ticket to climbing the social ladder in the US and integrating into elite circles of capital. 2 years later, when World War II ended, that title would become even more valuable. Whether he went to Europe or Japan, it would grant him a superior status, allowing him to extract resources at a minimal cost. So, whether it was buying bonds or outright donations, he needed to maintain that status. Still, the way the military held him over a barrel left him frustrated. Haha. Darling, don't look so glum. Compared to Howard in New York, you've got it easy. He was outright conscripted by the military, Margaret teased, trying to comfort him. I can't compare to him. He's an aviation expert. I'm just a high school dropout, Josh replied, shaking his head. But he couldn't help but wonder, wasn't Howard Hughes supposed to live in Los Angeles? Darling, you shouldn't underestimate yourself. You're only 16 and already own 3 factories and have secured military contracts. Especially with the glucose isomerase and high fructose syrup your sugar factory produces, those are monopolistic products. Your future accomplishments will undoubtedly surpass his, Margaret said, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and leaning against him. Oh, and guess what? This USO tour in Chicago includes many Hollywood stars, like Jane Russell, Whitney Frost, Paulette Goddard, and more. Especially Whitney Frost. Her performance with Judy Garland in Ziegfeld Girl was outstanding. Whitney Frost. Josh was confused. He'd never heard of her. Jane Russell, however, rang a bell. She was Howard Hughes' mistress and had faced backlash during World War II for wearing overly revealing outfits in a movie. Afterward, her roles dwindled to minor parts. Let's check the program on the invitation, Margaret said excitedly. Josh smiled wryly and opened the invitation. The next moment, his expression changed drastically. Margaret, what's the full name of the Howard you just mentioned? He asked. Howard Stark, of course. Why? Margaret replied, puzzled by Josh's sudden nervous tone. Standing behind him, Margaret didn't notice Josh's pale face as his eyes locked onto a program item titled, Captain America. Chapter 44. Captain America, who's brave and strong enough to save America? Not everyone can storm the beaches, but we can all cheer them on. Who vows to fight day and night to defend the truth? E-Series Defense Bonds. Every purchase means another bullet in a soldier's rifle. Who spreads the word door to door, carrying the flag across the nation, from east to west, across the land? Draped in the stars and stripes, he bears it all. Unlike the previous small-scale charity drives aimed at the upper class, this time, the United Service Organizations, USO, were marketing bonds to the general public. Naturally, the venue wasn't a private mansion but Chicago's Grand Theater. The Grand Theater, one of the top 3 in the United States, was built in 1865 and had been rebuilt once since. With a capacity to hold 4,000 people, it was the perfect location for such an event. Inside the theater, Josh sat in the VIP section, his smile frozen as he watched a muscular man clad in a stars and stripes costume awkwardly performing a musical number surrounded by singing and dancing women. Among the audience, Josh seemed to be the only one forcing a smile. The rest were clearly enjoying themselves, their faces lit up with enthusiasm as applause echoed through the hall. What's wrong, Josh? Don't you like the show? I think it's wonderfully done. Margaret, sitting beside him, clapped her hands excitedly as she asked. It's nothing. Just not used to such lively crowds, Josh said with an awkward chuckle. But his demeanor couldn't fool Margaret. She had noticed Josh's distracted mood ever since they received the invitation days ago. Whenever she tried to ask, he would deflect with vague responses. What could he say, though? That he originally thought this was just a mundane parallel world where he could use his dimensional trading system to become a corporate tycoon, only to now realize it was the high-stakes Marvel Cinematic Universe. He was terrified out of his mind. No way he could explain that. The truth was, Josh had been blindsided because he didn't read enough newspapers. Coming from a digital age, he hadn't developed the habit of poring over newspapers. He only paid attention to local Chicago news, so it wasn't surprising that he missed information about Howard Stark and Captain America. When he finally read up on them later, he realized everything matched the movie version. Howard Stark's appearance, the scale of Stark Industries, everything aligned with what he remembered. In the comics, Stark Industries had been founded by Howard's father before World War I and had already become a powerhouse. However, in this world, Howard was born in 1917 in Manhattan's Lower East Side to a fruit vendor father and a seamstress mother. He graduated from university in 1934 and built his empire from scratch. Stark Industries wasn't formed until 1939 and was still a fledgling company reliant on military and British contracts. It was no wonder the company wasn't on Josh's radar yet. Realizing he was in the Marvel universe had been a shock, but after days of reflection, Josh calmed down. So what if it was Marvel? The truly dangerous era revolved around the Avengers' main storyline, which was decades away. For now, threats like Hydra operated covertly, and the risk wasn't too high. By the time the main events of the Avengers unfolded, New York in 2012, the snap in 2018, that was 70 years away. Who knew if he'd even live that long? Though, with the dimensional trading system as his cheat, his odds of survival were quite high. Mr. Khan, why don't you take a photo with our Captain America? You've purchased another million in bonds, and the public should see the contributions you're making. Suggested Senator Brandt of New York, a key organizer of the USO drive, smiling warmly at Josh. Josh had purchased fewer bonds this time, but $1 million was still an impressive sum. Many larger amounts came from established financial giants. Given Josh's status as a young philanthropist, Senator Brandt saw him as the perfect example to inspire modern American youth. Of course, it would be my honor, Josh said with a practiced smile. But could we take a few photos without the captain's mask? I think that would make for a more personal keepsake. Certainly, that's a reasonable request, Senator Brandt agreed after a moment of thought. As Josh stood next to the maskless Captain America for a photo, he couldn't help but evaluate the man in front of him. Captain, up close, you're even taller and more impressive than I imagined. I wish I had a physique like yours, Josh said with a smile. You flatter me, Mr. Khan. You're still young, and I'm sure you'll grow even taller and stronger, Steve Rogers replied earnestly. Steve couldn't help but admire Josh, who, at just 16, was already 6 feet tall. Despite his own transformation into a super soldier, Steve only stood about 6'2". After the photo, Margaret teased, you said you didn't like Captain America, but you seemed pretty happy taking a picture with him. Josh smiled faintly and said, Margaret, believe me when I say this, he will become a true hero, someone the world will one day look up to. Just as Josh was about to leave, a towering figure pushed through the crowd and approached him. Dix, what are you doing here? Josh asked, surprised. Boss, we've got trouble. A shipment of ours was hijacked, Dix whispered urgently. Josh's expression darkened. Turning to Margaret, he said, Margaret, I'll take you home first. Something's come up at the company. Margaret, sensing the seriousness, didn't ask questions and nodded quietly. As they left the theater, Steve Rogers, still on stage, glanced thoughtfully in their direction, having noticed the commotion. Chapter 45. Winning Hearts and Minds. Tell me, what happened? After dropping Margaret home, Josh got back in the car and motioned to the driver to start driving. He then turned to Dix and asked, was it the cigarettes or the sugar? By sugar, Josh wasn't referring to corn syrup. The corn syrup, being a new product, was tied to a government contract and entirely supplied to the military. However, Josh's sugar factory also produced granulated sugar on the side. The raw materials for this came from his deals with Daenerys, cheap, unrefined cane sugar or raw sugar from Westeros, processed into pure white sugar in his factory. Some of this was sold back to Daenerys at a premium, while the rest was offloaded into Chicago's black market, reaping enormous profits. The profits from the sales of white sugar and tobacco far exceeded those from the military contracts. But, as is the nature of illegal businesses, they were prone to attracting unwelcome attention. Josh had always known this day would come. Both 10,000 cartons of cigarettes and 1 ton of sugar, all of it ready for shipment to New York, was seized at the docks. 5 of our men are dead, 2 are critically injured, and only 1 managed to escape and inform me, Dix said grimly, his tone heavy with the loss of his subordinates. Hearing this, Josh narrowed his eyes. At a minimum price of $10 per carton of cigarettes and $20 per kilogram of sugar, the total losses amounted to a staggering $120,000. Any leads on who did it? Josh asked. Not yet. The operation was efficient. By the time we arrived, the goods were already gone. Dix shook his head. But I've notified both Mr. Schneider and Mr. Dietrich. They might have found something. Josh nodded and fell silent, lost in thought. Roughly half an hour later, Josh and his entourage of 3 cars arrived at Anna's diner. Anna was the widow of Louis, the man who had been fatally shot during a jewel heist. Originally, Dix had taken care of Anna and her children out of sympathy. However, Anna's stunning looks and figure, which rivaled the best socialites Josh had encountered, had eventually won Dix over. Now, their relationship was serious, with marriage on the horizon. Because of this connection, Anna's diner had become the de facto meeting spot for Josh and his associates. The convoy of 3 cars was there for a reason: Josh's personal security. While Josh wasn't yet at the level of Chicago's top moguls, his growing wealth, influence, and public profile necessitated a personal security team. His security detail consisted of over 20 men, all hired from the refugee camps at the city's port. Chicago, being the 3rd largest city in the U.S., attracted a large number of immigrants. Those who lacked money or connections ended up in overcrowded camps, living in appalling conditions while waiting for immigration approval. These camps, with over 30,000 refugees, were barely a step above concentration camps. Hunger wasn't the issue. Starvation wasn't allowed. But disease, cold, and squalor claimed lives daily. Josh selectively recruited family-oriented individuals, many of whom were former soldiers, prioritizing those of German, Austrian, and Nordic descent. With a generous relocation and settlement package, Josh secured their unwavering loyalty. At the diner, the only people inside were Schneider and Dietrich, who had been waiting. Have you uncovered anything? Josh asked as he sat down on the sofa, commanding the room with his presence. Sheriff Dietrich has some leads, Schneider replied, indicating that Dietrich should take the floor. This wasn't surprising. Of everyone in Josh's group, Dietrich was the closest to being a true local power broker in Chicago. Well, Dietrich began, I've got informants in every district. After hearing about the theft, I had them dig around. Tonight, 5 groups in the city made notable moves. One was the old Italian Moretti family, and another was Fat Old Man Murphy's Irish gang. But both of these were involved in an all-out gang war, so they're not likely suspects. The remaining 3 are the Falcone family, another Italian group, the Wild Dogs, a Spanish gang, and a Jewish faction. My gut says Falcone is unlikely. They've been in decline since their leader, Salieri, was imprisoned 5 years ago. So that leaves the Spanish and the Jewish gangs as prime suspects. Josh asked, tapping the table thoughtfully. Yes. But that's just a guess. We'll need to locate the stolen goods to confirm. There's always the chance it was the work of some ambitious upstarts, Dietrich admitted with a shrug. Chicago, being a melting pot of ethnicities and criminal enterprises, was rife with both large and small gangs. Every day, new gangs appeared while old ones disappeared. Josh nodded. While he didn't need the kind of evidence police would require, he still needed clarity on the culprits. Targeting the wrong group could lead to unintended consequences. For now, stay on top of it. Notify me as soon as you find any concrete information. We may not be a formal gang, but we're not vermin to be trifled with. Also, Schneider, allocate funds from the shipment's revenue to compensate Dix. Give $10,000 for each of the deceased and $5,000 for the injured. Make it clear to everyone. Those who fight for me will be taken care of. At the mention of compensation, everyone present was visibly moved. In this era, a typical gang leader might offer a token $1,000, $2,000 to the families of fallen members, if they were particularly benevolent. Most deaths, however, went uncompensated. Even the U.S. military's death gratuity for soldiers was $6,000, making Josh's offer exceptionally generous for the time. Though they all knew this was a calculated move to win loyalty, none of them cared. A boss willing to spend like this was rare and worth following. For Josh, spending a few tens of thousands to solidify loyalty was a small price to pay. With the Dimension trading system at his disposal, earning money was the least of his worries. Beyond the lucrative black market profits from sugar and tobacco, his warehouses were still brimming with gold and silver from his deals with Daenerys. Chapter 46. The Jewish Gang. Speak up, what's the situation? 2 nights later, in the same restaurant, Josh asked Lyndon Schneider. Just half an hour ago, Josh received a call from Schneider with an update about the stolen goods. It was the Jews, Schneider replied. Are you sure? Josh asked. It's confirmed. The information comes from our partners in New York, the Corleone family, Schneider nodded. Originally, that batch of goods was meant to be sold to them. But according to the latest news, the goods have ended up in the hands of their rivals, the Marcellia family, whose collaborators in Chicago are the Jewish gang. Since we've identified the culprits, you know what to do, right? Josh stated firmly. Hearing the name of the Corleone family didn't surprise Josh. He was already aware of their existence. As the mastermind behind his growing operation, Josh didn't interfere in the day-to-day dealings, but he made sure to understand the basics. Key underground forces in Chicago, New York's 5 major mafia families, and large-scale gangs across the U.S. When Schneider first established contact with the New York faction, Josh learned about the Corleone family. He hadn't been overly concerned at the time. After all, he was already dealing with peculiar characters like Margaret from the Dial M for Murder and Sabrina, possibly a nod to the Audrey Hepburn film. Another connection to The Godfather didn't seem out of place. However, compared to the knowledge that Captain America and Howard Stark existed in this universe, the Corleone family seemed trivial. Boss, this might not be so easy to handle, Schneider hesitated before continuing. Oh, why not? Josh frowned. Because, according to the Corleone family, this incident wasn't orchestrated by Chicago's Jewish gang alone. It was sanctioned by the Marcellia family, Schneider explained. The Marcellia family, Luciano. Did our business offend him? Hearing this, Josh started paying closer attention. If it were just Chicago's Jewish gang, Josh wouldn't have been too worried. But if the Marcellia family was involved, it was a different story. The Marcellia family was led by none other than Lucky Luciano, one of the most significant figures in Josh's original world, known as the head of the Genovese family within New York's 5 mafia families. In this timeline, Luciano was still operating under the Marcellia family name, with Josh casually referring to him as Luciano, because of his eventual rise. Luciano was also the mastermind behind the National Mafia Commission, Cosa Nostra, an unparalleled crime syndicate in the U.S. Under Luciano's leadership. The Mafia enforced 2 major rules. No drug dealing and no assassinations of law enforcement officers. However, several years ago, Luciano was imprisoned by New York Governor Dewey. He was currently serving as a librarian in jail, remotely managing the Marcellia family. Josh's operation, having only recently emerged, shouldn't have been significant enough to provoke such a powerful figure. Could this conflict stem from dealings with the Corleone family? But that didn't seem plausible. The balance between New York families typically discouraged open hostility. No, it wasn't Luciano who gave the order, it was his key lieutenant, Meyer Lansky, Schneider clarified. Meyer Lansky. But we've had no direct dealings with him, Josh remarked, puzzled. He certainly knew who Meyer Lansky was. Luciano's trusted partner, the brains behind many operations, and the godfather of Jewish organized crime in America, commanding immense influence among Jewish gangs nationwide. It's not about direct dealings, boss. Before we entered the market, Lansky's Jewish gang was the largest producer and distributor of contraband cigarettes in the country. Tobacco has been one of their primary revenue streams, Schneider explained. Our cigarettes are of higher quality and more competitively priced. I believe that's why they've moved against us. Schneider's explanation made everything clear to Josh. They had inadvertently encroached on the biggest Jewish gang's most lucrative territory. This was a tricky situation. Despite his rapid growth, Josh's fledgling operation was no match for an established mafia powerhouse like Lansky's faction. How has the Corleone family responded to this? Josh asked, his expression darkening. They've chosen to stay neutral. They said they'll still buy from us if we can deliver the goods, but beyond that, they won't get involved, Schneider replied, somewhat helplessly. If I had to guess, this was a warning. If we continue the shipments, similar incidents will likely occur. The Corleone family clearly wanted no part in a direct confrontation with Meyer Lansky. While tobacco profits were high, they weren't worth the risks of crossing Lansky's formidable network. HMPH, they want the profits without the risk. What a convenient position. Josh sneered. But despite his frustration, there wasn't much he could do. Jews, they were indeed a troublesome group. Josh's expression darkened, his resentment going beyond the stolen goods. It also stemmed from his past knowledge in his former life. Many people knew about the persecution of Jews during World War II, but few were aware of the complex history between Jews and Josh's original home country. For instance, during the war, China had sheltered numerous Jewish refugees, yet some of these refugees colluded with Japanese forces, attempting to establish a Jewish state in northeast China, a plan that ultimately failed. Additionally, the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act had surprising ties to Jewish figures, such as Samuel Gompers, a Jewish American labor leader. As a cigar maker by trade, Gompers felt threatened by the influx of skilled and affordable Chinese laborers in the cigar industry. His efforts to stoke anti-Chinese sentiment among white laborers laid the groundwork for exclusionary policies that reverberated across the U.S. Now, in his current life, Josh found himself once again at odds with powerful Jewish factions, this time, over the lucrative tobacco trade. Chapter 47. The Blackwater Gang, Meyer Lansky, huh. Definitely a troublesome figure, Josh remarked, tapping the table lightly in thought. It wasn't that Josh was afraid. But for someone of Austrian descent like him, Lansky's Jewish identity added an extra layer of complexity, especially since Meyer Lansky wasn't just the godfather of Jewish organized crime. He also held another title, a prominent anti-fascist pioneer. During Roosevelt's New Deal era, Lansky collaborated with the government to dismantle the infamous American fascist organization, the Silver Shirts. This meant that Lansky not only wielded significant influence in the underworld but also had extensive connections in political circles. For Josh, a new immigrant of Austrian descent, confronting someone like Lansky head-on would be unwise. However, a grin soon spread across Josh's face. Why confront him directly? Chances were, Lansky didn't even know Josh existed. After all the manufacturing and selling of goods had been managed by Lyndon Schneider and Dix. While Schneider was a German immigrant, Dix was a true blue Irishman. And those who had been killed or injured in the recent robbery. All 7 of them were Irish. In the pre-Black and Latino era, the 3 dominant organized crime groups in America were the Irish, Italians, and Jews. Which of the 3 was the largest and most widespread? It wasn't the Italians or the Jews. It was the Irish. The first major immigrant group among the 3, the Irish, were the true pioneers of American organized crime. However, the Irish mob had a significant drawback, a penchant for petty violence and poor organizational discipline. Many of their elite members were more inclined toward politics. As a result, over time, while the Irish rose to dominate American politics, the underworld power vacuum was filled by the more organized Italians and Jews. Hey, Schneider, I understand your concerns. But have you forgotten? Dix and his men are Irish. And historically, the Irish have always been America's largest criminal group. They may be scattered now, but what if we organize them? Josh finally spoke, noticing Schneider's puzzled look. Schneider paused for a moment, then quickly grasped Josh's intent. It wasn't that Schneider hadn't thought of this. But for Germans of this era, with their Prussian-style education and reputation for excellence, they were typically part of the societal elite in fields like the military, commerce, politics, and research. Even criminals like Schneider often operated as highly organized thieves. They rarely saw much value in organized crime. This was why, despite being America's largest single ethnic group, there were hardly any German-dominated criminal organizations. Even if Germans delved into crime, they'd likely create groups like the Silver Shirts or paramilitary forces. But Josh was different. He lacked the innate pride of German-speaking people of this era. He was already imagining how powerful a gang led by the Irish but managed with German efficiency could become. And with the Mafia's organizational model already in place, it was just a matter of replication. If he couldn't even replicate something like this, Josh figured he might as well stay home and cuddle with Margaret. Not long after, Josh summoned Dix and Schneider, worried that Dix might act impulsively if he learned the robbery was linked to the Jewish mob. He had initially kept him in the dark. Jews. Boss, just say the word, and I'll gather my men and wipe them out. Predictably, Dix couldn't sit still after learning who was behind the robbery. If Josh hadn't been present to restrain him, Dix might have already been on his way to raid the Jewish mob's territory. Calm down, Dix. Revenge will come. But there's something else I want to discuss with you first, Josh said, motioning for Dix to sit down. Anything you say, boss. Dix reluctantly complied. Dix, have you ever thought about becoming a boss? Like Colosimo or Dean O'Banion back in the day, Josh said directly. T.N. Author mentioned both of them even though Colosimo was Italian, he deliberately mentioned Colosimo and O'Banion, 20th century Irish crime bosses in Chicago. He avoided referencing Al Capone, as Capone was Italian. While Colosimo and O'Banion were ultimately overshadowed by the Italians, their fall was partly due to bad luck and a lack of ruthlessness compared to someone like Capone, who wasn't afraid to use heavy weaponry. Boss, I'm not sure I understand. Dix scratched his head, confused by Josh's sudden proposition. It's simple. I'm planning to establish a gang. Let's call it the Blackwater Gang. But the boss won't be me, it'll be you. Schneider here will act as your advisor. You'll recruit soldiers from refugee camps to serve as instructors and officers. Beyond that, the rest is up to you. Find a plot of land in the suburbs and set up a training camp. All members must undergo military training. I know this may seem demanding, but with enough money, most people will be willing. I'll provide all the initial funding. Once the gang is operational, you'll continue distributing my goods, and I'll give you a 30% cut of the profits. As for other sources of income, I won't take a single penny, it'll all be yours. Josh continued, my only two rules are no drug dealing and no human trafficking. Dix's face lit up with excitement. While straightforward, he wasn't stupid. He understood that under this arrangement, he wouldn't just be a puppet but would hold significant autonomy as a gang leader. Meanwhile, Schneider's expression turned complicated. To him, Josh wasn't creating a gang. He was forming a mercenary army. A militarized gang. That sounded terrifying. Add the right weapons to the mix, and groups like the Mafia or Jewish mob wouldn't stand a chance. Moreover, neither the Italians nor the Jews could replicate such a model. They weren't interested in military-style operations. They were in it for the money, not the fighting. Chapter 48. Going on vacation after assigning tasks related to the Blackwater Gang, Josh returned to his regular life. The subsequent responsibilities were left to Dix, the newly appointed leader, and Lyndon Schneider, the strategist, to handle. Josh's only roles were to fund the operation and place a few accountants in the gang. Of course, it would take months for the newly formed gang to develop combat capabilities. After all, even the U.S. Army requires at least 3 months of training before deployment. But as the saying goes, revenge is a dish best served cold. While Josh wasn't willing to wait 10 years for revenge, he could certainly afford to wait a few months. Aside from occasionally checking on the gang's progress, Josh shifted his focus to Europe. With Captain America's emergence and nationwide tour, Johann Schmidt, also known as Red Skull, leader of Hydra, had made progress in his research on the Tesseract. Declaring independence from Hitler, Schmidt established Hydra as a separate faction and launched indiscriminate attacks against both Allied and Axis forces. With advanced energy weapons, Hydra quickly gained the upper hand. Notably, the infamous tank battle at Prokhorovka turned into a stage for Hydra's energy-powered vehicles. However, the Allies, oblivious to the true threat, misinterpreted Hydra's attacks on Nazi forces as a sign of victory. They took advantage of the distraction to land in Sicily and push into mainland Italy. By the time the Allies reached the Alps, having secured Italy, they halted their advance, waiting for Hydra and the Nazis to exhaust each other. Thus, World War II began to diverge significantly from traditional history, aligning instead with the trajectory of the Marvel Universe. For Josh, these developments were of little concern. He had no intention of altering history. Interfering could risk derailing events to the point where Captain America might fail to defeat Red Skull, leaving the East Coast vulnerable to destruction. A scenario Josh could not afford. Besides, even if he wanted to intervene, there was little he could do. Was he supposed to take the fledgling Blackwater Gang to Europe and join the war? Josh and Margaret were playing tennis in their backyard. Although October had brought cooler weather to Chicago, the sunny skies and physical activity kept them lightly dressed. Margaret, despite being a wealthy socialite, was no fragile flower. On the contrary, she was quite athletic. Her previous marriage to a tennis player had also honed her skills. However, as a woman, she was at a disadvantage in terms of height and strength. Soon, she was out of breath, struggling to keep up. Josh, while not initially skilled at tennis, had spent nearly a year in this world, playing regularly with Margaret. Over time, his technique had significantly improved. Effortlessly serving, volleying, and smashing, he watched Margaret scramble across the court, amused by her determination and secretly admiring the scenery. Enough. Don't you know the concept of ladies first? Margaret pouted in mock frustration after failing to return a decisive smash. She handed her racket to a maid and plopped down under the sunshade, sipping iced tea. Speaking of iced tea, it might remind people in Asia of popular brands. However, iced tea was actually an American invention. Initially, both Asians and Europeans drank tea hot. It wasn't until the early 20th century that someone added ice and lemon to tea, making it an instant hit in America. While some sources claim iced tea originated in 1904, others argue it was 1929. Josh leaned toward the latter, considering the invention of the refrigerator in 1923 made ice more accessible to ordinary people. My apologies, darling. That was entirely my fault, Josh said, sitting beside Margaret and cheekily reaching for her tea. Sir, you have a call, interrupted a maid as Josh teased Margaret. Excuse me, dear. I'll be right back, Josh said apologetically. Go on, then. I need a shower anyway. Pity it's too chilly for a swim, Margaret sighed, shooing him away. Josh smiled, said nothing, and went to answer the phone. Margaret headed to the bathroom for a shower. When she finished, she found Josh waiting in their bedroom. Margaret, you mentioned wanting to swim earlier. He asked with a grin. Yes, why? She replied, curious. How about a vacation in Florida? He suggested, pulling her into his arms. Really? Can you afford the time? Margaret asked, surprised. Despite Josh's daily leisure time with her, she knew he was busy managing factories and other ventures. Of course. My businesses are running smoothly. Everything is on autopilot now, Josh assured her. In truth, his decision had another motive. Chicago, and other cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Atlantic City, were about to descend into chaos. To ensure their safety and avoid suspicion, a vacation seemed like the perfect escape. Florida's warm climate and palm-lined beaches are perfect this time of year, Josh added. That's wonderful. How will we travel? By cruise or plane? Margaret asked excitedly. By plane. It's faster. We can charter one and reach Florida in a few hours, Josh replied. The iconic Douglas DC-3 had been revolutionizing air travel since 1935, though tickets remained prohibitively expensive for most people. For Josh and Margaret, however, cost was no concern. In fact, buying the plane outright wouldn't be an issue, it only cost about $20,000. Chapter 49. Let me broaden your horizons. Outside Chicago's Cook County Jail, 5 luxury cars idled across the street. Among them, in the middle car, Dix leisurely smoked a cigarette, waiting for the prison gates to open. Today was a special day for him, and for 2 reasons. First, it was the release day of his good friend, Goss Minis. Goss Minis was one of Dix's former gang members and a key figure in their notorious jewelry heist. Following that case, thanks to Josh's arrangements and connections through Sheriff Dietrich, Goss had taken full responsibility for the beating death of Tony Windus. This ensured that Dix and Lyndon Schneider were either exonerated or granted bail, while Goss was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years. But Dix never forgot his brother. Through financial maneuvering and legal appeals, Goss's sentence was reduced, and just 6 months later, he was being released. As the metal gates of the prison creaked open, a slightly hunched figure emerged, escorted by a guard. The hunched posture wasn't due to mistreatment. Goss had always been somewhat stooped. In fact, his 6 months in prison had been more like a holiday. He had a private cell, special meals, no mandatory labor, and even occasional female visitors arranged by Dix. Life inside had been comfortable, to say the least. This was the nature of a capitalist society. With money and connections, even a prison sentence could feel luxurious. Only the poor and powerless had to suffer hard labor and grim conditions. When Dix spotted Goss, he immediately stubbed out his cigarette and stepped out of the car to greet him. From his side, Goss, upon seeing the imposing figure of Dix, was overjoyed rather than envious. He wasn't new to prison life and understood well that without Dix's support, his time behind bars would have been far more grueling, let alone his early release. Seeing Dix waiting for him with such grandeur also made him feel that taking the fall had been worth it. Haha. Welcome back, buddy. Dix gave Goss a hearty bear hug. With his small stature and height of less than 5 feet 7 inches, Goss looked almost comical next to Dix's towering 6 feet 5 inches frame. Why all the fanfare? Bet this cost a fortune. Anyone who didn't know better would think some mafia boss was getting out. Goss joked. While he knew Dix now worked for a wealthy boss, he had no idea about the changes in his status and assumed the display was just to celebrate his release. Haha, and who else could that boss be? Of course, it's you. Dix puffed his chest proudly. Allow me to introduce myself properly. Leader of the Irish Blackwater gang, Dix Handley. Are you drunk? Goss froze, thinking his old friend was joking. He even leaned in to sniff for alcohol on Dix's breath but found nothing. Get outta here. I'm dead. Serious. Enough talk. It's your big day, and I'm taking you to see something special. Rolling his eyes at Goss's disbelief, Dix threw an arm around his shoulders and led him to the car. Once inside, Goss began to sense that something was different. Unlike the 4 Ford V8 cars flanking them, high-end but relatively affordable, Dix's car was a Cadillac Fleetwood Series 75 limousine. This was a car fit for presidents, dignitaries, and crime bosses alike. Even across the ocean, prominent leaders used this model. In American movies, like The Godfather, such vehicles were synonymous with power. Beyond its luxurious interior and imposing size, what really caught Goss's attention was a small fold-out seat near the rear door and a strange object on the floor covered with a tarp. Dix, what's going on? Goss gulped nervously, recognizing the outline beneath the tarp. It was unmistakably a heavy-duty weapon. Hey, I told you, I'm broadening your horizons, Dix replied with a sinister grin. At his signal, the convoy began to move. Goss sat tensely, his eyes locked on the object under the tarp. It was becoming clear that his old friend was no longer just a petty street thug. Dix had ascended to something much more dangerous. The convoy traveled for some time before stopping in a narrow alley. Rolling down his window, Dix called over a young lackey stationed nearby. What's the situation? Dix asked. They went in about 15 minutes ago, the lackey reported. Dix glanced at his watch, nodded, and instructed, keep an eye on them. The lackey nodded and disappeared down the alley. Dix leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes to rest. Meanwhile, Goss sat frozen, afraid to ask questions. But he was starting to put the pieces together. He knew this area well. It was deep within the territory of the Jewish mob, one of Chicago's most powerful factions. After about 30 minutes, the young lackey returned, panting. Boss, they're about to come out. Let's move. Dix barked, snapping awake. The convoy started up and repositioned itself 2 blocks from the entrance of a high-end hotel. Moments later, a group of well-dressed men emerged from the building. These were the Jewish mob's top leaders, fresh from a meeting. But their instincts, honed by years of living on the edge, immediately sensed something was off when the convoy stopped nearby. They began to retreat and reach for their guns. It was too late. The windows of the front and rear cars rolled down, and the muzzles of several Thompson submachine guns poked out, unleashing a fiery barrage. From the central Cadillac, Dix signaled Goss to open the door. Dix stepped out and onto the fold-out seat, revealing the heavy weapon beneath the tarp. A Colt M1919A4 heavy machine gun. In the next moment, its deafening roar filled the street. Goss instinctively covered his ears as hot shell casings rained down on him, occasionally landing on his clothes and scorching him. In just half a year, his old partner had transformed into a true crime lord. And Goss, now caught in the whirlwind of this new reality, could only watch in stunned silence. Chapter 50. Still the machine gun. Gunfire roared, and blood painted the streets red. Bystanders screamed and scattered in terror. Faced with the ferocious firepower, 7 or 8 Jewish gang members, including their boss and key leaders, couldn't even draw their guns before collapsing in pools of blood. Dix and his crew emptied 2 rounds of magazines and, without even sparing a glance, swiftly drove away from the scene. The entire operation lasted no more than 2 minutes. It wasn't until 10 or so minutes after their departure that the police finally arrived at the scene, sluggish as ever. Only 2 cars and about 4 or 5 officers responded, not because of negligence, but because at that exact time, similar attacks had occurred in over a dozen locations across the area. Without exception, all these locations were key strongholds of the Jewish gang. The only difference was the firepower used elsewhere. In most cases, attackers wielded submachine guns, whereas Dix's operation employed a full-fledged machine gun. By this time, Dix's convoy had arrived at an abandoned dock. All the used firearms and spent casings were collected and loaded onto a waiting boat. The boat then set off to deep waters, where the weapons were dumped overboard. Meanwhile, another group of Dix's men swapped the license plates on several cars, which were then driven off in different directions. These vehicles would eventually be taken to separate repair shops, repainted, and thoroughly cleaned of any evidence. Dix himself got into another car parked at the dock, taking Goss along with him. "How do you feel?" Dix asked, opening a case in the car and pulling out 2 bottles of whiskey. He handed one to Goss. "Intense," Goss said, taking a deep swig. "I've only ever read about something like this in the papers. It's hard to get used to." "Ha ha ha, you'll get used to it eventually, my brother," Dix laughed, clapping Goss on the shoulder. "Stick with me, and soon the entire underground world of Chicago will be ours." Goss took another gulp of whiskey. Though still in shock, he couldn't deny that he found the experience thrilling. The events in Chicago seemed to signal something larger. In the following days, in New York, several Jewish gang leaders were assassinated by highly trained attackers. In Atlantic City, 2 prominent Jewish gang bosses and their men were gunned down in their cars late at night. In Los Angeles, one of the most famous Jewish crime lords of the era, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, was taken out by a sniper. In San Francisco, the home of a Jewish gang boss was set ablaze. The wave of attacks on Jewish gang leaders quickly caught the attention of both the Italian mafia and federal authorities. For the mafia, the situation was personal. Ever since the establishment of the commission under Charlie Luciano, the Italian mafia and Jewish gangs had developed a close partnership. Jewish gangsters often acted as advisors to the Italians. Seeing their partners under attack, the mafia couldn't ignore the situation. As for the authorities, they couldn't turn a blind eye either. So many daylight murders couldn't go unnoticed, especially since many officials were tied to the Jewish gangs themselves. Initial investigations revealed a clear pattern. All the targeted individuals were closely associated with the most prominent Jewish gang boss in the United States, Meyer Lansky. In other words, the attacks seemed to be driven by a vendetta against Lansky. However, this clue wasn't enough to pinpoint the perpetrators. After all, as the top Jewish mobster in America, Meyer Lansky had more enemies than anyone could count. Based on the attacker's highly trained behavior, both the mafia and the authorities initially suspected agents of Nazi Germany or Hydra. The reasoning was straightforward. The attackers exhibited a clear European military style, disciplined and precise, operating like soldiers or covert agents. Meyer Lansky had a long-standing enmity with Nazi supporters. During the Silver Legion's rise in the U.S., Lansky organized Jewish gangsters to confront them head-on, often without using guns, relying solely on fists and determination to drive the fascists into hiding. Furthermore, Lansky had helped the FBI crack numerous German and Hydra spy cases. This made him a thorn in the side of both the Nazis and Hydra. Given these factors, both the Mafia and the FBI naturally assumed the attacks were orchestrated by external forces rather than an internal gang feud, complicating matters further. The attackers didn't seize any territories, goods, or money from the Jewish gangs, breaking from typical gang warfare patterns. Faced with such an unprecedented situation, the Mafia quietly began absorbing the abandoned territories, while the FBI launched extensive investigations into recent European arrivals. Their efforts unearthed several spies, but they failed to uncover the true perpetrators. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. The focus of these attacks, Meyer Lansky himself, had yet to be targeted. This was primarily because Lansky wasn't even in the US at the time. He had been in Havana, Cuba, overseeing operations for nearly half the year. At the time, Cuba was under military rule, and American gangsters operated there with impunity, thanks to heavy bribery. When news of the attacks reached Lansky in Havana, he wasted no time preparing to return to Miami. Due to limited international flights, Lansky opted to travel by boat. Havana and Miami were only about 400 kilometers apart, a half-day trip by ferry. Upon his arrival in Miami, Lansky was met at the dock by his entourage. 4 or 5 cars and over 20 bodyguards, forming an impenetrable shield around him. But as they prepared to leave, a Ford pickup truck carrying a load of hay passed by. Suddenly, the hay was pulled aside, revealing a deadly weapon. A Browning M1919 machine gun, far deadlier than the one Dix had used in Chicago. Chapter 51. The Second Dimensional Beacon, Mr. Josh, your previously ordered oil removal service has been completed. Have a good day. Half an hour later, in a mansion in West Palm Beach, only about 100 kilometers from Miami, Josh listened to the voice on the phone and smiled with satisfaction. After hanging up, Josh happily opened a bottle of champagne, poured 2 glasses, and walked out into the backyard. In the outdoor pool in the backyard, a mermaid was swimming gracefully and happily. What happened? You look so happy, Margaret asked curiously, swimming to the edge of the pool and emerging halfway out of the water to see Josh holding 2 glasses of wine. Although the U.S. had passed laws prohibiting the sale of alcohol to minors as early as 1933, when prohibition was repealed, there were no laws prohibiting minors from drinking alcohol themselves. As a result, underage drinking was still quite common in that era. But Margaret knew that Josh didn't like to drink. He only indulged in champagne or red wine on special occasions, and never actively sought to drink. Yet here he was, opening a bottle of champagne of his own volition. Clearly something worth celebrating had happened. Nothing much, just completed an investment. Though there won't be an immediate return and I've invested a considerable amount of money, the future is promising. Josh smiled as he handed one of the champagne glasses to the beautiful woman, clinking the glasses lightly. When celebrating something joyous, how could one do without wine and a beautiful companion? So that means you're done with your work now, right? Margaret subtly avoided asking about the investment and instead finished her glass next to Josh before speaking. Yes, why do you ask? Josh nodded. In that case, get down here. Margaret grinned mischievously, grabbed Josh and pulled him into the pool. She quickly swam away, treading water at a distance and laughing heartily at the now drenched Josh. Very well, my lady, you have successfully captured my attention. Are you ready for the coming revenge? Josh said, feigning a deep voice as he emerged from the water and fixed his gaze on Margaret. Revenge? Little sir, can you even catch me? Margaret teased with mock disdain. How could any man hold back? Don't run away. If I catch you, you'll see if I'm short or not. Josh roared in mock anger and swam quickly toward Margaret. Soon the backyard was filled with playful splashing, laughter, and cries for mercy. Soon the mood changed to harmonious melodies of bliss. Compared to the cold of Chicago, Florida's warm climate was so pleasant that Josh and Margaret found it hard to leave. They decided to settle in Palm Beach for the long haul and bought a piece of land to build their own vacation home, as opposed to their current rental villa. From then on, they could escape to this haven every autumn and winter. It wasn't just a luxury, it was a sound investment. For in the future, Palm Beach would become a haven for billionaires. Although land prices in Palm Beach weren't cheap at the time, they weren't exorbitant either. Building a mansion was not a significant financial burden for Josh and Margaret. Moreover, with the Jewish gang no longer a hindrance, Josh's tobacco business flourished uninterrupted, bringing in massive daily profits. However, since the primary tobacco production and sales were based in the northern cities, with a newly established base in New York, Josh often found himself shuttling between Chicago, New York, and Miami, acting as a frequent flyer to replenish supplies and collect payments. The reason for not setting up a factory in the South was simple. While it wasn't impossible to sell tobacco in the South, the profit margins were much lower. Several southern states grew tobacco, and nearby countries like Cuba were major tobacco producers, making it difficult to command high prices. To optimize operations, Josh even made good on a promise he'd made earlier, spending nearly $30,000 on a customized DC-3 aircraft for personal trips. Meanwhile, under the leadership of Dix and Lyndon Schneider, the Blackwater gang's influence was rapidly expanding, fueled by the booming illegal tobacco and sugar businesses. Unlike traditional gangs that sought territorial control, the Blackwater gang's strategy of leaving room for profit made them popular with Irish gangs across the country. Through these lucrative ventures, Dix gained a vast network and significant influence within the Irish mob, emerging as a leader among them. This rise naturally alarmed the Italian mafia, who began to feel threatened as the Irish gained momentum. At first, the mafia suspected foreign interference behind the downfall of the Jewish gang, but soon realized it was likely the work of the mysterious Blackwater gang. Attempts to counterattack proved futile, as the Blackwater gang members were well trained, making assassination attempts ineffective. Retaliation against the mafia was swift and devastating, with entire families wiped out. In Chicago, the Italian mafia's influence was completely eradicated and their territories divided among Irish gangs. With official backing and support from the Irish and German American communities, the Blackwater gang solidified its control. As 1943 turned into 1944, the power dynamics of the underworld had completely shifted. It was then that Josh finally received the long-awaited second-dimensional beacon from System, a year in the making. Chapter 52. Yuri. On a night in February 1944, Josh sat alone in the study of his Chicago residence, waiting quietly. Today marked the refresh of the dimensional beacon. For this reason, he had deliberately scheduled his supply run for the Blackwater gang to align with the day, ensuring he could return to Chicago and avoid any distractions. As the seconds ticked by, the countdown on the system finally reached 0. Deploy the beacon immediately. As soon as the new dimensional beacon refreshed, Josh wasted no time issuing the command. The dimensional beacon has been deployed, searching for a suitable user. Following Josh's instructions, the beacon began its deployment. Under his expectant gaze, the system screen displayed a notification indicating the matching process had completed. As the screen transitioned to a new view, it revealed the interior of a cave. Wait, a cave. Josh's heart sank slightly. From his experience, the living environment of the beacon's host often provided clues about their potential. For example, Daenerys, the first person matched, had been in a state of misfortune, living in a Dothraki tent. While she had been exceptional enough to overcome her circumstances, at least she'd had a tent. But now, a cave. When the host finally appeared, Josh's heart dropped even further. Before him stood a bald, wild-looking man clad in an assortment of crudely sewn-together animal pelts. Could this really be some primitive tribesman? What's this? A dimensional trading system. Fascinating. Truly fascinating. A device capable of enabling communication and transactions between different universes. What an astonishing invention. I can't imagine what level of civilization could create something so incredible, the man said, breaking the silence. This speech stopped Josh in his tracks. When the dimensional beacon matches a host, it performs a basic information transfer. This transfer simply conveys the purpose of the device, a superficial understanding without any deeper knowledge. Yet the terms universe and civilization flowed effortlessly from this person's mouth. These were not words a primitive man, no matter how intelligent, should casually use, even with the system's translation feature. Just from these two words, it was clear this person was no mere primitive. Was this individual, like Daenerys, another extraordinary figure merely down on their luck? Hello, I'm Josh Kahn, a dimensional trader. May I ask how I should address you? Josh inquired cautiously. Greetings, Mr. Kahn. I am Yuri. You may simply call me Yuri. As for my identity, a scientist, politician, military strategist. Ha ha ha. Let's just say I'm currently a man in exile, Yuri replied with a chuckle and a shake of his head. Yuri. Yuri. At first, Josh didn't think much of it, but the bald head caught his attention, sparking a sudden realization. Could this be that Yuri? But his current appearance. You seem to recognize me, Yuri noted, catching Josh's reaction. Are you the Yuri, former minister of operations for the Soviet Union, and later the founder of Yuri's nation? Josh asked, swallowing hard in disbelief. Oh, you do know me. Could it be that we come from the same world? Or perhaps your world has a similar counterpart to me? Yuri asked with genuine curiosity. No. While there are many similarities between our worlds, my world doesn't have someone like you. Additionally, the timeline in my world should be far earlier than yours. It's currently only 1943. However, I previously encountered another individual selected from your world, someone from the Rising Sun Empire. I learned of your achievements through him, though sadly, his fate was unfortunate, and he perished before we could trade, Josh explained, his mind racing to fabricate a plausible story, ultimately pinning it on the Japanese Empire from Yuri's universe. He was practically ecstatic. This was far from bad luck, it was the jackpot. The equivalent of winning the lottery's grand prize. This was Yuri, the Yuri from Red Alert. A man who rivaled, No, surpassed Einstein in intellect. The Rising Sun Empire. Your luck must have been terrible. That insignificant nation merely survives between the Allied and Soviet powers. Even if their representative had lived, they likely wouldn't have had anything worthwhile to trade. Yuri sneered at the mention of the Rising Sun Empire. In his era, the Rising Sun Empire was little more than a colony of the Allies and a frontline in their confrontation with the Soviets. You're absolutely right, Mr. Yuri. However, your current situation doesn't seem too favorable either, Josh ventured carefully. In truth, Josh already had a theory about Yuri's predicament. The Red Alert 2 and Yuri's Revenge storylines had three possible endings. First, Yuri is reduced to a mere brain, stored in a Kremlin basement. Second, he is imprisoned within Einstein's psychic isolation chamber. Third, he is sent to the Cretaceous period via a chronosphere, his fate unknown. From the looks of things, the third scenario seemed to fit best. Ahem. Didn't that Rising Sun representative tell you my ultimate fate? Yuri asked, though he suspected the truth. After all, both the Soviets and the Allies would likely keep such information classified, given the chronosphere's significance. No. He only mentioned that you went missing and that the official records were vague about your whereabouts, Josh replied, feigning ignorance. Fair enough. My current situation is indeed dire. I am alone and far removed from any civilization. The era I'm in is the Cretaceous period. Still, perhaps this is good news for you, Yuri mused, stroking his chin. Oh, how so? Josh asked curiously. Do you recognize this? Yuri pulled out a silver, metallic object. And this is? Josh asked, puzzled. This is iridium. Iridium metal, Yuri declared, his voice tinged with amazement. Surely you've heard of it. Chapter 53. This is doing a good deed. Iridium metal. Josh certainly knew what iridium metal was, and he had to thank the first Avengers movie for it. One crucial scene showed Loki gouging out the eye of a German scientist to scan his retina, allowing Hawkeye to steal a large chunk of iridium from a vault. That iridium was then used to stabilize the portal for the Chitauri invasion. After watching the movie, Josh had looked into it and discovered that iridium was an expensive platinum group metal with extremely stable chemical properties. It was one of the most corrosion-resistant metals, insoluble in acid. Even boiling aqua regia couldn't dissolve it. Moreover, Earth's reserves were very limited. Iridium was primarily used in cutting-edge scientific instruments and as an alloy additive. It was also a key raw material for smartphone and electric vehicle batteries. Its price ranged from $5,000 to $6,000 per ounce, around 1,000–1,500 RMB per gram. Sounds high-tech and valuable, right? But here's the harsh reality. The market demand for iridium was relatively low. Even in the 21st century, when electronics were ubiquitous, global demand only reached a few tons annually at its peak, sometimes even less. Back in Josh's world of 1944. Do you know what iridium was used for? Fountain pen nibs. In other words, demand for it was minimal. Selling small amounts was pointless, and larger amounts simply wouldn't sell. It was a complete waste. When Josh expressed these thoughts, Yuri immediately exploded in anger. Foolish. Utterly foolish. Who told you to sell it? Since you've interacted with people from my timeline, don't you know about the war factory? The Apocalypse tank. Tesla troopers. Tesla coils. The magnetic reactor. Not just the Soviets. Many of the Allies' military technologies rely heavily on iridium for their core components. In our world, iridium is one of the most fiercely contested strategic materials between the Allies and the Soviets. And you're telling me this stuff doesn't sell? It was a good thing they were in separate universes. Otherwise, judging by Yuri's expression, he might have strangled Josh on the spot. Josh opened his mouth but couldn't muster a response. What could he say? That his world lacked such technologies. Forget 1944 America. Even in Josh's previous life in the 21st century, much of the technology in Red Alert was purely science fiction. But Yuri's attitude made one thing clear. Josh might lack the technology, but Yuri certainly didn't. Although he was stranded in the Cretaceous period, as one of the most brilliant scientists in the Red Alert universe, Yuri was likely capable of feats on par with Tony Stark from the future. Give him the right tools, and he could practically build anything from scratch. Josh forced a smile and said, Yuri, sir, don't be angry. I'm just young and inexperienced. I didn't recognize the value of what I had. Whatever you need, just say the word, and I'll do my best to fulfill it. HMPH, at least you're not entirely hopeless, Yuri muttered. Well, I don't need anything urgent for now. Just get me some food and drinks, especially vegetables and alcohol. The Cretaceous period is a barren wasteland. Apart from dinosaurs and ferns, there's hardly any larger mammals to be found. Also, prepare a typewriter and some paper for me since I assume there's no computer in 1944. I'll draft a list of the equipment I need, sorted by priority, and you can procure them gradually. Oh, and if possible, send me a few people, Yuri winked suggestively. Living in the Cretaceous period, Yuri had survived by using his psychic abilities to control dinosaurs. Unlike his clones, Yuri himself could control over 100 beings at once, even more so when the creatures had simple minds, like dinosaurs. Although food, drink, and safety weren't major concerns for him, the loneliness of isolation was hard to bear. As a man of ambition, Yuri hadn't sunk to the level of desperation where he'd, say, pursue a relationship with a lizard like certain infamous figures. But now, with the interdimensional trading system at his disposal, he saw no reason not to indulge a little. Josh immediately understood what Yuri wanted. People. No problem. Josh had avoided buying people through the system because he lacked means to control them and feared they might expose his secret. Selling people to Yuri, however, was a completely different story. As someone with a moral conscience, Josh abhorred the idea of human trafficking. But if the people in question were heinous criminals, that was an entirely different matter. They were, after all, trash, not people. Where could he get the criminals? Easy. With a word to his subordinates and his connections, Josh could easily acquire a batch. Besides, these criminals faced real hardship in the US. Josh rationalized that sending them to the resource-rich Cretaceous period, where they would have Yuri's protection, was essentially a rescue mission. Freedom. Who needed that when survival was guaranteed? They already worshipped power, didn't they? The more Josh thought about it, the more justified he felt. Criminals. Well, not ideal, but I can work with it, Yuri said, clearly displeased but willing to compromise. Sure, but you'll have to wait until the war ends next year. I'll head to Europe to fetch some for you, Josh replied. In the post-war chaos, when much of Europe was famine-stricken, acquiring people under the guise of providing aid wouldn't attract much attention. Plus, sending them to the Cretaceous period for pioneering work was arguably better than letting them starve. Yes, this was a good deed. No doubt about it. Josh felt practically saintly. Oh, by the way, Mr. Yuri, besides iridium, could you prepare some dinosaur eggs for me? Josh suddenly remembered. Chapter 54. A request. Francesca, are you asleep? Josh called as he walked out of his room. Not yet, sir. Is there something you need? A young woman in her early 20s appeared at the top of the stairs. She was Francesca, a new maid from Italy whom Josh had recently hired. Since both Josh and Margaret had been in Florida throughout the winter, the few experienced servants had gone with them, leaving only two to stay behind and rotate in looking after the house in Chicago. Francesca was one of them. Is there any food left in the house? If so, could you prepare something? Make sure there's more vegetables, enough for 2 people, and also bring up 2 bottles of red wine. Josh asked. Although Josh hadn't been home much lately, he always made sure to inform the servants who were staying behind, and since they needed to eat as well, there were always some basic supplies in the house. Large-scale trades with Yuri were out of the question, but he could still meet Yuri's immediate hunger. As for the materials required for actual transactions, Josh had already contacted Lyndon Schneider to take care of it. It was estimated that everything would be ready by tomorrow afternoon. Mr. Khan, would small veal steaks be acceptable? We also have some mushrooms, lettuce, carrots, and cabbage. Francesca asked cautiously. Just prepare whatever you think is best, and also get some fruit, Josh replied casually. After all, he wasn't eating himself. As for Yuri, before being bound by the dimensional beacon, Yuri had been living in the Cretaceous period for over a year. Although Yuri, as an expert in mind control, didn't need to worry about survival and was eating dinosaur meat daily, he didn't have proper cooking equipment or seasoning. Josh could easily imagine how miserable his life must be. So, even though there were veal steaks and vegetable salads, Yuri would probably consider even a few slices of dry bread a delicacy right now. Okay, sir. Francesca nodded and immediately went to prepare. Meanwhile, Josh returned to talking to Yuri. Although Josh wasn't particularly interested in a lonely, bald old man, Yuri, after spending over a year isolated in the Cretaceous period, was eager to talk to a human and couldn't stop chatting. In exchange for hearing about the super technology in the Red Alert world, Josh had no choice but to indulge him. Yuri went on about how he went from an experimental subject to becoming one of the Soviet Union's most important scientists and military commanders, eventually becoming a power-hungry dictator who almost built the mighty Yuri Empire on the moon. After hearing Yuri's rambling for over half an hour, Francesca knocked on the door, bringing in the meal. Josh temporarily shut off the trading system and opened the door to let Francesca in. However, after delivering the food, Francesca hesitated and looked at Josh with uncertainty. Is there something you need, Francesca? Josh asked, immediately sensing that she might want to discuss something with him. Well, Mr. Khan, my brother got into trouble last winter and was arrested. Because he speaks Italian, he was recruited into the army. Last November, he was captured, but Captain America saved him. Unfortunately, he was shot while escaping, and it's only recently that he's recovered and received a month's leave. He'll be back in Chicago next week, Francesca said, hesitating. And, what does this have to do with me? Josh asked, feeling a little curious. Wasn't this the time when Captain America saved Bucky, making a name for himself? Captain America rescued not just Bucky but also many other soldiers from several nations, including British, French, and even Soviet soldiers, numbering in the thousands. That's also why Captain America became a hero adored by major allied nations, not just the US. It's my mother. She knows you're a big deal, so she asked me to see if there's any way you can help so my brother doesn't have to go back to the front lines. My father passed away in an accident last year, and my brother is the only man left in the family. My mother is scared that if he goes back to the battlefield, he won't come back. Mr. Khan, please, I'm begging you, I'll do anything you ask if you can help. Francesca pleaded. Anything. Josh, who was mentally more like a man in his 30s, immediately started to think in a less innocent way. Looking her over, Francesca was wearing a maid's outfit. Well, the traditional maid's dress was long and conservative, making it hard to see anything, but her face was delicate. She wasn't a super beauty, but she would rate an 80 out of 100. Then, Josh's mind wandered to Margaret's beautiful face, and he shook his head. What's his name? Which unit is he in? Josh asked, as this wasn't a big deal for him. He could handle it with just a phone call, and since she was one of his servants, helping her out wouldn't be a problem. Vito Scagliano. He's serving in the 504th Parachute Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. Francesca replied excitedly, thinking that Josh had rejected her at first. All right, I got it. I'll take care of it. Josh waved his hand, signaling Francesca to leave. Seeing this, Francesca quickly left the study. Josh opened the trading system again. Yuri was still waiting, and Josh traded the food and wine for 2 dinosaur eggs. These were the eggs of a Pachycephalosaurus, but Yuri didn't want Josh to incubate them or do anything with them. He just wanted Josh to try them. According to Yuri, these were the best tasting eggs he had eaten in the past year. Nice, fine wine. But too bad, I still prefer vodka. Yuri said as he eagerly took a swig from the wine bottle. Tomorrow's supplies will include vodka. It's very cheap. 1 bottle of wine could buy dozens of vodka bottles, Josh replied. Although he didn't drink, seeing Yuri drink like this made him roll his eyes. The wine in his house was a special collection of Margaret's and was very expensive. But Yuri clearly didn't care, devouring the food greedily. He only had a few bites of the veal steak before digging into the vegetables and fruit salad. No surprise, meat was plentiful in the Cretaceous period, but vegetables were scarce. Occasionally, they could get some tender ferns to substitute for vegetables. It was a pitiful situation. While Yuri ate, Josh took the opportunity to briefly introduce the situation in his world. But when Josh mentioned Red Skull, Captain America, these super soldiers, and the Tesseract, it clearly piqued Yuri's interest. Chapter 55. Fried dinosaur eggs. By any chance, could you get me some of that? energy sample from the Tesseract and some blood samples from the super soldiers. After finishing his meal, Yuri asked Josh. The technologies from different worlds might spark new ideas. However, as soon as Yuri made his request, Josh immediately furrowed his brow. Because whether it was the super soldier blood or the energy samples from the Tesseract, both were basically impossible for Josh to acquire. Especially the Tesseract. When he first realized that this world was part of the Marvel Universe, as a time traveler, he had of course thought about the super soldier serum and the Tesseract. But that was all it was. Just a thought. Captain America wasn't like the Mafia. Even if Josh equipped the Blackwater mercenaries with machine guns, tanks, armored vehicles, or fighter jets, they probably wouldn't even scratch him. The likely result of such an endeavor would be that Josh would be labeled as a spy coveting the highest military secrets of the United States, leading to his arrest. And as for the Hydra weapons based on the energy of the Tesseract, forget about it. Without going to Europe and taking down a few Hydra battalions, there was no way to get them. The harshness of the European battlefield was well known, and Hydra's presence made the danger level exponentially worse. Only super soldiers like Captain America stood a chance there. Ordinary people would be nothing more than cannon fodder. That's why Josh never considered stepping foot in Europe before the war ended. But now Yuri was aiming for both of these things. Was he joking? I understand, Josh said, after a pause. This isn't urgent. Once we start official trading, I will prioritize finding some equipment for you. With that gear, you and your people will be able to move more safely on the European battlefield. But of course, if you don't want to, I won't force it. As long as I have good equipment, at least there will be a higher chance of obtaining energy weapon samples. But the super soldier blood is still very difficult, Josh added after thinking for a moment. As of now, there were only 2 super soldiers in the world, Captain America and Red Skull. Getting blood samples from either of them would be nearly impossible. Plus, by early 1945, Red Skull would be transported to Vormir, and Captain America would fall into the North Atlantic. Josh had at most a year to work with. As for retrieving Captain America after his fall into the Atlantic, that wasn't realistic. The North Atlantic was vast, and finding a crashed plane wasn't easy. In the movie, Captain America was found because the ice drift had brought him to the surface. In contrast, the Tesseract, with its high energy readings, might be easier to track down. That's why, in the movie's final scene, Howard Stark could find the cube but not Captain America. As for Bucky, he had been injected with a version of the super soldier serum created by Dr. Zola when he was captured. Even getting Bucky's blood would require Josh to go to Europe. After all, since Captain America and his team set foot in Europe, they hadn't returned to America. It's fine. Let nature take its course. What's meant to happen will happen, and what's not meant to happen, don't force it. That's life, isn't it? Yuri casually responded with an old saying. You actually understand Chinese. Josh stared, wide-eyed, at Yuri. Is it surprising? I can speak 18 languages, Yuri raised an eyebrow. Okay, fine, you're the expert. Though it's hard to obtain super soldier blood, there is a very special type of blood. I wonder if you'd be interested, Josh asked Yuri. Oh, what type of blood? Yuri seemed intrigued. The legendary creature, the dragon, Josh answered. Of course, I'm interested. Yuri's eyes lit up at the mention of dragons. Why was Yuri so interested in super soldier blood? Because Yuri wasn't just a physicist. He was extremely well versed in biology as well. In the Red Alert universe, Yuri's faction even had a super soldier-like unit, the Beastmen. They were created by optimizing various animal genes and combining them with human DNA. So when Yuri heard Josh mention super soldier blood, his first thought was to combine those genes with the Beastmen. Additionally, dinosaur genes were also on his list of research targets. And now, hearing that Josh could get dragon blood, he was even more excited. That's great, but for now, it's too early to discuss all of this. The urgent matter is to help you re-enter the industrial age. Once we do, I'm sure I'll have plenty of things for you to help me research. We'll call it a day for now, though, it's getting late. Looking at the clock, Josh realized it was already early morning and decided to end the lengthy conversation. Sorry, darling. Business affairs have changed a bit, and I may be stuck in Chicago for a while, Josh called Margaret early the next morning. It's fine. I've grown tired of being here too, so I think I'll head home instead, Margaret replied. Upon hearing that Josh couldn't come back, she decided she'd return to Chicago since winter there would be over soon. Josh had no objections to this. After bidding Margaret goodbye, he made a call to arrange for a private plane to pick her up. Francesca. After hanging up the phone, Josh called out to the maid, who was busy making breakfast. Sir, do you need anything? Francesca asked. I have 2 ostrich eggs in my study from a friend. Could you try cooking one of them? The other one, just put it in the fridge, Josh instructed. The ostrich eggs were actually dinosaur eggs Josh had traded with Yuri. Of course, he couldn't tell Francesca that they were dinosaur eggs, so he simply claimed they were ostrich eggs. Fortunately, despite the head-butting dinosaurs being much larger than ostriches, their eggs weren't significantly bigger. Upon hearing Josh's request, Francesca was a bit confused. Ostrich eggs. She had never cooked one before. But since Josh had asked, she couldn't refuse, especially after she had asked him for help the previous day. Since it was just an egg, she assumed it might be similar to cooking a regular chicken egg, just a bit bigger. Francesca nervously found the 2 eggs in Josh's study and moved them to the kitchen, putting one in the fridge and preparing to crack open the other. Wait. Just as Francesca was about to crack the egg, Josh walked into the kitchen. I'll do it myself. You can go now. Though Francesca was confused, she obediently left the kitchen. Once she was completely out, Josh sighed with relief. Because he had just realized, if either of those eggs was already formed into a dinosaur, there would be a serious issue. Hurrying over, he sent the maid out, preparing to handle it himself. The eggshells were quite thick, and after some effort, Josh cracked one open. Fortunately, it wasn't yet formed, and the contents were just like any other egg. However, the smell was strong. Could this actually be tasty? He scrambled the egg and made himself a dinosaur egg scramble. Once cooked, the strong smell dissipated, and the texture was softer than chicken eggs. It actually tasted quite good. However, the egg weighed over 3 pounds, so the portion was large. Since eggs weren't meant to be consumed in such quantities, Josh only ate a third of it. As for the rest, the maid would take care of it. After finishing breakfast, Josh headed out to prepare for the goods he was expecting. Chapter 56. I have many legitimate businesses, how is it going? Any challenges with the new batch of goods I requested? Josh asked Lyndon as they sat together in a restaurant. The scheduled time hadn't arrived yet, but since both of them worked mostly in offices, they naturally arrived early for their meeting. Unlike them, Dix was constantly on the move due to the growing influence of the Blackwater gang and rarely stayed in Chicago for long. Since he was often in transit, he was expected to arrive a little later. As for Dietrich, who had recently been promoted from sheriff to district police superintendent thanks to Josh's influence, his new position made it inappropriate for him to be seen regularly at the restaurant. As a result, Josh rarely attended these meetings unless he felt his presence was necessary. Most of it isn't a problem, but the industrial equipment and the poultry from Japan will take a little more time, Lyndon replied. While he found the request for Japanese poultry odd, he wisely refrained from questioning it. After all, it didn't violate any of the rules Josh had previously established for the gang. Since Pearl Harbor, sentiment toward the Japanese in the United States had plummeted. With a few exceptions, most Americans had a strong disdain for them. Immigrants from other Asian countries hated them even more, especially in light of the atrocities committed in Asia during this time. No rush on that. Take your time. Any other good finds lately? Josh nodded before changing the subject. Well, there's a lot of pretty unique merchandise. A collection of early M1897 military training rifles. Not sure you'd be interested, Lyndon said. Shotguns. Not really appealing, Josh replied, assuming Lyndon meant the Winchester M1897. He dismissed the idea, since shotguns, with their limited range, didn't have much use in a world like Westeros. Ahem. Not shotguns, artillery. The French missiles. Lyndon quickly clarified. Josh's eyes lit up. Lyndon was referring to the French Schneider Company's M189 775mm field guns. For Chinese audiences, this artillery had an even more famous nickname, 2nd Battalion Commander's Italian Cannon. Despite its fame, the M1897 had already begun to show its age during World War I. By the end of the war, it was largely obsolete, either dismantled or sold to Asian countries. But that didn't bother Josh at all. This light field artillery, though obsolete by modern standards, was portable, powerful, and ideal for Daenerys' army. As her forces now regrouped at Dragonstone and prepared to conquer Westeros, these cannons would be perfect for both sieges and fighting the White Walkers. This is excellent stuff. How many units? Do they come with enough ammunition? Josh asked eagerly. There are 200 units available, but the ammunition is limited, less than 5 basic loads per gun on average. Most of it is high explosive and shrapnel, Lyndon replied. In U.S. artillery terms, a basic load was 50 rounds. That meant each gun had about 250 rounds, enough to take out significant obstacles in Westeros. Perfect. Contact the seller, negotiate the price down as much as you can, and arrange for storage. I'll send men to pick them up, Josh said with satisfaction. Lyndon nodded, not questioning how Josh would handle the transport. Both he and Dix knew about Josh's mysterious transport team. After a while, Dix arrived, accompanied by Goss, who had risen to become the third most influential figure in the Blackwater gang. Sorry, boss, for being late. Dix greeted Josh with his usual courtesy, a trait Josh appreciated. No worries, we got here early. Have a seat. By the way, I hear those Italians are causing trouble again. Josh said as he poured Dix a glass of Kentucky bourbon. Yeah, especially in New York. Those families have brought in some new Jewish recruits, making it hard for the Irish gangs there to break their blockade, Dix replied, taking a sip of his favorite drink. The Jews again. They're hard to root out, Josh remarked with a shake of his head. As much as he disliked them, he had to admit their resilience. Overall, it's not much of a problem. Their influence is mostly confined to New York State. Elsewhere, like in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, the mafia families are starting to side with us because they make more money that way, Dix said with a grin. That's a good thing. It's all about profit. Just be careful, don't trust them too much. If the money stops flowing, you'll be the first one they turn on, Josh warned, nibbling on a cookie Anna had baked. By the way, boss, with the gang's growing influence, we've taken on a lot of new businesses. Are you interested in any of them? Dix asked. You know I'm not interested in gang business. Except for some goods, all other profits from your ventures are yours, Josh replied. Hold on, boss, these are legitimate businesses. Dix chuckled. Oh really? You expect me to believe that with that sly grin? Josh teased, laughing along with Lyndon. No, I'm serious. Dix insisted, his massive frame leaning forward. All right. Tell me, what are they? Josh said, holding back his laughter. I have 2 Hollywood movie studios, partial ownership of a major radio network, a newspaper company, 3 factories, and I'm planning to invest in Las Vegas, Dix listed confidently. Chapter 57. Vito Scaletti. You'd never expect it, but when Dix gave Josh the rundown, it was a real shocker. Unlike Lyndon Schneider, who was merely surprised by the mention of a movie company, although he's a talented man, but his personality screams, old perv. After a while of knowing him, Josh was more impressed by the nature of these industries. Setting aside the casinos in Las Vegas and the 3 unspecified factories, the other assets, movie companies, Blue Network shares, and a newspaper, painted the picture of a budding media empire. For those unfamiliar, the Blue Network later became ABC, the American Broadcasting Company. Before 1941, both the Blue and Red networks were owned by NBC. The difference: the Red Network focused on commercial entertainment and music, while the Blue Network provided unsponsored cultural and news programs. After concerns about monopolization, the federal government ordered NBC to divest one of its networks. NBC chose to keep the Red Network, and in 1943, the Blue Network was sold to Edward Noble, a candy tycoon, for $8 million. Josh recalled reading about that sale in the Chicago Tribune. Since Noble was from Illinois, it was a big deal locally. At the time, Josh didn't have the funds for such an acquisition, so he could only dream about it. Never did he imagine Dix would hand him some of those shares on a silver platter. How'd you get Blue Network shares? Josh asked, clearly intrigued. Credit goes to those Italians. The Irish in Springfield had been struggling against them and asked us for help. After we wiped out the Italian operations, the Irish rewarded me with these shares, Dix replied smugly. Springfield, the capital of Illinois, is also home to the famous Springfield Armory. And what about the other assets? Josh inquired further. The two movie companies were originally owned by Jewish businessmen. One belonged to Siegel, the guy the first dealt with earlier. The other was owned by a smaller time player. As for the newspaper, just a small local publication, Dix elaborated. The three factories are a cotton mill, an agricultural airfield, and a tire factory. The latter two are barely breaking even, close to bankruptcy. Josh nodded thoughtfully. These seemed like decent opportunities. The airfield and tire factory, in particular, likely suffered from material shortages or lacked military contracts, which made survival hard during wartime. All right, list out all these assets for me. I'll have an accounting firm evaluate them, and I'll buy them at market price. As for Blue Network shares, I need you to acquire every single one of them, Josh decided. After business concluded, Josh prepared to leave. Dix and Schneider tried to drag him to one of their chicken farms, a brothel, but Josh adamantly refused. In truth, he was saving his energy for the next day. Margaret was coming back, and he wanted to make sure everything was perfect. Besides, he had a batch of goods to deliver to Yuri, which would keep him busy. A few days later at the Chicago Union Station, a loud train whistle sounded as a passenger train slowly rolled in. Before the train fully stopped, a soldier in U.S. Army dress uniform jumped off eagerly. The soldier scanned the crowd and quickly spotted the person waiting for him, a modestly dressed young woman. Vito, over here, the woman called out excitedly. The soldier wasted no time running toward her, drawing smiles from bystanders who assumed they were a couple. But they were wrong. These two weren't lovers, they were siblings. Hey, sis, it's great to see you. Come here. The soldier scooped his sister up in a bear hug. Vito, I'm so glad you're home. The woman replied, holding onto him tightly. Didn't I tell you not to come pick me up? Vito asked after their embrace. No way. If I hadn't, you'd have trouble finding our new home, the young woman teased. New home? You didn't mention this in your letters. Vito exclaimed, surprised. We just moved recently. It's so much better than the old place. Not only that, I've paid off father's debts. She said proudly. Your boss must be quite generous. Vito nodded, recalling that his sister had mentioned working as a maid in her letters. While he wasn't thrilled about the job, it seemed to have worked out. Yes, Mr. Kahn and Miss Margaret are wonderful people, she replied. This young woman was none other than Francesca, Josh's housemaid, and the soldier was her younger brother, Vito Scaletta, fresh from the battlefield. You even have a car now. Vito remarked in astonishment when they reached a parked vehicle. Oh, it's not mine. I don't drive. Mr. Kahn arranged it because he knew I'd be picking you up. This is Mr. Brooke, one of Mr. Kahn's bodyguards. Mr. Brooke, this is my brother, Vito, Francesca explained. It was only then that Vito noticed the man behind the wheel. As Vito shook hands with Brooke, he immediately sensed something familiar. This wasn't just a driver. Brooke was clearly military, just like him. Chapter 58. The test subject. Don't mention it. We're all working for the boss. Brooke waved his hand and drove off. It seems your boss might be more impressive than I initially thought, Vito remarked as he watched the car drive away. Why do you say that? Francesca asked, puzzled. If I'm not mistaken, that driver used to be a soldier, one who's seen action on the battlefield, Vito explained. Really? I didn't notice. But it's no big deal, Mr. Kahn isn't just a celebrated war hero featured in the papers, but also a military supplier. Having a few veterans on his staff doesn't seem unusual, Francesca replied thoughtfully. Seeing her naive response, Vito shook his head and chose not to say more. From his experience on the battlefield, he could tell Brooke's demeanor didn't match that of the typical laid-back American soldiers but was more akin to the disciplined German soldiers he had encountered. Why is our new home here? Isn't this Irish territory? Vito asked, shifting his attention to the neighborhood. The house was in the west side, an area far better than their old home in Little Italy, but it raised concerns for him. For years, neighborhoods in Chicago were segregated by ethnicity. Italian immigrants like them rarely ventured into areas dominated by other groups, unless they were wealthy enough to avoid trouble. For someone like Vito, who had grown up amidst the street politics of Little Italy, moving into Irish-controlled territory seemed like asking for trouble. Vito, don't say that. Things are different now. The Italian mafia is almost non-existent in Chicago. It's the Irish who call the shots. But don't worry, Mr. Karn holds a high position in the city. The gangs here know I work for him, so they wouldn't dare cause trouble, Francesca reassured him. All right. By the way, sis, have you seen Joe? He took off with all the goods from our last job before I got arrested. Did he ever give you the money? Vito asked, changing the subject. The Joe he mentioned was Joe Barbaro, someone he had once worked with before getting conscripted. Unknown to Vito, Joe had already been dealt with, disposed of by Khan and traded to Daenerys Targaryen for reasons best left unexamined. No, I haven't seen him since you got arrested. And as for the money, nothing. If it weren't for Ms. Margot's kindness, we wouldn't have even had enough to bury father. Now that you're back, please find a proper job and stop associating with those types, Francesca said earnestly. You worry too much, sis. The war isn't over yet, Vito replied, feeling a mix of frustration and affection for his sister. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you. I asked Mr. Khan to help get you discharged from the army, and he agreed. Tomorrow, you'll come with me to thank him, Francesca said cheerfully. What? Really? Is that even possible? Vito exclaimed, wide-eyed in disbelief. Of course. When Mr. Khan makes a promise, he keeps it, Francesca replied confidently. Vito opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. That night, lying in the comfort of his new bed, Vito couldn't sleep. The thought of finally escaping the horrors of the battlefield filled him with both relief and disbelief. The next morning, Francesca led Vito to Khan's mansion. Vito Scaletta, Khan, seated in his study, looked over the tall, handsome young man before him. Despite his imposing presence, Khan appeared younger than Vito had expected. Yes, sir, I'm Vito, Vito answered, feeling a little uneasy. Though Khan looked younger than him, his commanding aura was comparable to that of a high-ranking officer. Here's your discharge certificate, Khan said, pushing a document across the desk. It's an official document from the Veterans Administration, so you don't have to worry about any repercussions. Thank you so much for your help, Mr. Khan, Vito said sincerely, his admiration for Khan growing. He knew how difficult it was to obtain a formal discharge during wartime. Most people could only hope to forge medical records, yet Khan had provided official documentation. It's nothing. Francesca is a diligent worker, and I'm not a stingy employer. Helping her with this small favor was no trouble, Khan replied with a wave of his hand. Then, his tone changed. I heard that you were saved by Captain Rogers during the war. Yes, sir. Captain Rogers rescued both Captain Bucky and me. If it weren't for him, I would have died on Hydra's test table, Vito said, taking the opportunity to flatter Khan. He had noticed the unmasked photograph of Captain America on the wall and correctly assumed Khan had connections with him. But Khan wasn't interested in the flattery. His expression turned serious as he focused on one specific detail. You said you and Bucky were on the test table together. Khan asked, his gaze locking onto Vito with intensity. Chapter 59. Work for me. Yes, sir. At the time, Mr. Bucky and I were both tied to the experiment table and injected with some strange, unknown substances. Although subsequent tests by the military laboratories showed no significant issues, I firmly believe that if Captain hadn't arrived in time, we would have been doomed. During our captivity, we never saw anyone leave those labs alive. Sir, is there something wrong with this? Seeing Josh's curiosity, Vito had no hesitation and recounted the situation in detail. When he noticed Josh's thoughtful expression, he couldn't help but feel puzzled. Oh, nothing's wrong. I just didn't expect your experiences to be so extraordinary. If written into a memoir, it would surely sell like hotcakes. Thinking about it, letting you retire early might have robbed the world of a legend. Josh came to himself and remarked casually, but internally his mind was racing. Injected with the same serum as Bucky. Could it be the Winter Soldier serum? Of course, just like Bucky, Vito was probably still a prototype. But who says prototypes aren't valuable? Perhaps, but I think being able to return home safely and reunite with my family is the greatest blessing, Vito replied with a smile, raising the retirement document in his hand. You're right. Family is everything. Josh nodded, then suddenly asked, now that you're back, Vito, what are your plans for the future? Maybe I'll become a dock worker like my father. At least, that's what my mother hopes for, Vito said with a hint of resignation. It wasn't the path he desired, but his traditional mother valued safety and stability. Oh, a war hero becoming a dock worker. Forgive me for saying so, but that's surprising. No disrespect to your mother, of course. It's just unexpected. From what you're saying, you haven't made up your mind yet. So, how about working for me? Josh's suggestion was calm but sincere. Work for you? Really? Vito was thrilled at the offer. He had come to understand that Josh wasn't just a boss, he was a powerful figure. Even without knowing the specifics of the job or the pay, it had to be better than hauling crates at the docks. Plus, with his sister already working for Josh, his mother likely wouldn't object. Of course. Why not? Josh shrugged casually. Thank you so much, Mr. Khan. Vito agreed without hesitation. Since you're one of us now, I'll share something with you. Josh waved off Vito's thanks and leaned in slightly. You've met Brooke, right? Josh asked. Yes, sir, Vito nodded. Last year, your sister borrowed a sum of money to bury your father. I paid off her debt through Brooke. Now, I'm not telling you this to make you feel indebted or ask for repayment. But during that process, Brooke uncovered something else, the possibility that your father's death wasn't an accident, Josh revealed. What? Is that true? Vito's expression changed dramatically. He had always believed his drunken father had fallen into the water and drowned, just as his sister had written to him. Considering his father's heavy drinking habits, it seemed plausible at the time. But if Josh's words were true, it was an entirely different matter. Though Vito had his grievances about his father, he was still his father. Moreover, Vito cherished some fond childhood memories of him. Whether it's true or not is up to you to investigate. I was merely a bystander at the time. If not for Margaret's request, I might not have even paid off the debt, let alone dig deeper into the matter. Now that you're back and working for me, I felt it was my responsibility to tell you. Go find Brooke. He'll share the details. As for starting work, there's no rush. Handle this first, Josh said calmly. Vito immediately understood Josh's implications. This wasn't just an act of goodwill, it was also a way of testing loyalty. I understand. Thank you, Mr. Khan, Vito replied with resolve before leaving Josh's study. Once Vito had left, Josh sat silently for a moment. He then stood, locked the door, and opened his trading device to contact Yuri. Do you need something, Josh? Yuri's image appeared on the screen. The background was still a cave, but within just a week, it had been transformed into a full-fledged laboratory. Controlled workers scurried around diligently, and Yuri, now clean-shaven and dressed in a pristine lab coat, had regained the imposing demeanor of his former self. I have good news. A prototype super soldier has walked right into my hands. Are you interested in studying him? Do you have enough equipment for that? Josh asked, glancing at the sophisticated equipment behind Yuri. The laboratory tools had been purchased at high prices from the University of Chicago, as many such devices couldn't be acquired on short notice. Fortunately, the university saw this as an opportunity to upgrade their own equipment and agreed to the sale. Of course, I'm interested. But researching him will require a few additional devices. Yuri's eyes gleamed with interest. Chapter 60. Revenge. A rite of passage. Mr. Brooke. After leaving Josh's study, the deeply preoccupied Vito quickly found Brooke, who was polishing a car under the guidance of a servant. Oh, it's you, Vito. What's the matter? Brooke paused his work and asked. Mr. Khan sent me to you. He told me that you know something about my father's death, Vito said, looking intently at Brooke. So, that's it. I do know something. Get in the car, Brooke said, nodding as he gestured for Vito to get in before taking the driver's seat. Without hesitation, Vito followed and sat in the passenger seat. Brooke drove them to the harbor district, specifically to the dock where Vito's father had worked. Hey, who are you guys? A worker approached as the car came to a stop. I'm looking for Vinny. Brooke casually tossed a cigarette his way. For dock workers, a few cigarettes were often enough to get things done. no need to spend actual cash. As for Brooke, he and his fellow bodyguards received cartons of cigarettes as part of their benefits from Josh, whose business included tobacco. This made it easy for them to afford such casual gestures. Vinny, someone's here to see you. The worker sniffed the cigarette, happily stuck it behind his ear, and shouted. Soon, a skinny, shifty-eyed young man emerged from the crowd moving cargo. Ah, Mr. Brooke. Seeing who had come, the young worker quickly approached with an ingratiating smile. He didn't know Brooke's true identity but was aware that he was someone important. Tell me everything you know about Antonio's death, Brooke demanded. Antonio was Vito's father's name. Oh, that. Heh, heh. Vinny chuckled nervously, rubbing his hands together before glancing at Vito. And who might this be? Not your concern. Speak, Brooke growled, tossing a half-used pack of cigarettes at him. Right, my apologies. Vinny quickly pocketed the pack, his grin widening. If I'm not mistaken, Antonio's death was Stefan's doing. Stefan? Who's Stefan? Vito immediately asked. He's Derek's enforcer and the top dog around here. That night, I saw them leave together, but only Stefan came back, soaking wet. The next day, we heard Antonio had drowned in the canal. What a joke. That canal's barely a meter deep. Kids wouldn't drown in it. Vinny said, vividly recounting the details. Vito's blood boiled as he listened. Although this was just Vinny's account, Vito found it mostly believable. He didn't know Stefan, but he was familiar with Derek, his father's boss and a notorious bully in the area. During his days as a troublemaker, Vito had heard Derek's name countless times. Do you know where Stefan and Derek are now? Brooke asked. Of course. Their office is right there on the second floor of that warehouse, Vinny said, pointing across the dock. Thank you, Vinny. You can go back to work now, Brooke said, patting the man on the shoulder. Sure thing, Mr. Brooke. But, you won't tell anyone I said this, right? If Stefan hears about it, he'll kill me. Vinny asked cautiously. Don't worry. This stays between us, Brooke assured him. Relieved, Vinny grinned and returned to his tasks. What's your plan? Brooke asked Vito, who had lit a cigarette and was smoking silently. Revenge, of course, Vito said, crushing the cigarette underfoot. Then I think you might need a little help, Brooke said, leading Vito to the car's trunk. Vito followed, puzzled. When Brooke opened the trunk and lifted a hidden panel, his eyes widened. A neat row of gleaming Thompson submachine guns lay cushioned on foam pads. Alongside them were several M1911 pistols. Take what you need, Brooke said, patting Vito on the shoulder. Wait a minute, are we seriously just going to storm in there with guns? Everyone here has seen our faces. Vito exclaimed, gesturing toward the dockworkers. This seemed reckless. If the police got involved, the witnesses would easily give them away. Relax, Mr. Khan's influence is far greater than you imagine. These workers wouldn't dare snitch, and even if someone did, the police wouldn't come after us. Also, this isn't our job, it's yours. Or are you telling me you can't handle a few thugs? Brooke said indifferently. Hearing this, Vito realized the truth. Brooke wasn't just a bodyguard, this was Josh's test, a way to both help Vito and bind him to loyalty. No, I can handle it, Vito declared confidently. After all, he'd survived the chaos of European battlefields. What were a few dock thugs compared to that? He grabbed two M1911s, checked the magazines, chambered rounds, and tucked them into his side holsters. Then he added two more to his back holsters and finally slung a Thompson under his coat. Dressed in a heavy winter coat, it was hard to tell he was armed to the teeth. Brooke dropped him off at the warehouse. Minutes later, the sound of gunfire erupted from the upper floor, like popcorn in a skillet. Brooke lit a cigarette and waited. When Vito emerged, Brooke had just finished smoking. Not bad. Efficient, Brooke said approvingly as Vito climbed back into the car. What about these? Vito asked, gesturing to the guns. Leave them on the backseat. I'll take care of it, Brooke replied. Vito nodded, placing the guns down before pulling out several bundles of cash and ration tickets from his pockets. What's this? Brooke raised an eyebrow. Found them in their safe. Derek had quite a stash. But according to the rules, I should hand it over, right? Vito said. Brooke burst out laughing. Rules. Kid, We're not a gang. Our boss doesn't care about this kind of pocket change. Keep it. Buy yourself some new clothes. Embarrassed, Vito chuckled awkwardly. His mindset was still stuck in the past, where leaders or officers always claimed the spoils. Still, after some hesitation, he split the cash in half and handed part to Brooke. What's this for? Brooke asked, surprised. Thanks for your help. I wouldn't have gotten revenge so easily without you, Vito said sincerely. Brooke smiled, his impression of Vito improving. A young man who knew how to share. He might just have a bright future. Support the original author by checking out their book. Links in the description.